So this one sat in my drafts for a few days, and that's not at all because I'm uncomfortable speaking about it. It's just on a platform like TikTok, we're limited to 3 minutes at a time, and it's sometimes hard to get a story as complicated and messy as addiction and recovery across on here. But I'll do my best, and it's likely to have a few parts to it. What I wanted to kind of start about, I can't talk about recovery without talking about my addiction and what I misunderstood about my addiction at the time that I was experiencing it, and for the 3 years following it when I classed myself as in recovery. These days I define myself as recovered, or more often I don't define myself by my addiction anymore, it's just part of my history. But at the time I very much saw my addiction as almost normal. I thought I was doing what everyone would be doing if they could get away with it. I really thought that everyone would be happier drugged up 24/7 because I just couldn't picture functioning without it. So that was a big misunderstanding that I had to shed to move on from it. The second misunderstanding was what I was taught in recovery. So I started my recovery through 12-step. I was in Narcotics Anonymous for about 3 years. And what I was taught there was that my addiction would have started extremely young, in childhood. It was an inherent part of who I was, and that it was a disease. And that all of my substance use and many of my behaviours, any kind of pleasure-seeking behaviours, had to be viewed through that lens, which gave me this perception of it being this huge problem, almost impossible to deal with, having to unpick every part of myself. Where now, when I look back at my addiction, the reality is that I, for a long time, had a relatively normal relationship with substances. I had very poor mental health, but my substance use was very rarely chaotic or unmanaged. I had a few periods of binge drinking in my late teens and early 20s, which I think is quite typical of my age group that I was in at the time. It never got out of control. It tended to self-regulate. If it got to a bad point, I would always naturally pull it back because I didn't like the consequences. My actual addiction was a period of about 18 months from early 2016 to late 2017, when I started using substances nearly daily, shortly followed by daily, when I was injecting and when I was very chaotic and unable to maintain healthy relationships or employment by the end of it. That was my addiction. And when I look at it as an 18-month problem of a response to a mental health crisis that I didn't know how to manage in any other way, suddenly that's something that's cut down to size, and actually I can deal with that. I can unpick what went wrong there. I can look at what I learned from it, and I can start to build from it. And once I started to learn that, I think that's when my recovery really started to go to a new level. So next, I'll talk a little bit about my recovery in part 2, coming very soon. I hit my breaking point at the end of 2017. It was November 2017 was when I went to my first Narcotics Anonymous meeting. By this point, I was engaged in treatment services and I was on a methadone prescription, which I hadn't been finding helpful. Some people do, but it didn't work for me. It didn't actually get rid of any of my cravings at all. But what it did do was heavily sedate me to the point where I couldn't even enjoy the hobbies and interests I'd been able to maintain throughout my heroin addiction. I just had nothing. I have very fuzzy memories of the last couple of months before I stopped using because I was just so out of it, sleeping about 20 hours a day, just living from one dose to the next. And I'd been warned about some of the issues with 12-step programs before I went. My family are ex-cult members, and I had been warned about all of the kind of red flags for identifying a cult, and I saw them all at my first meeting. And I was desperate enough that I decided that joining a cult and risking everything that came with that was better than the way that I was living. I really did go into it with my eyes open, but I lost that self-awareness relatively quickly. And a big part of how that happened was through a practice that I now know of as love bombing, but at the time I wasn't aware of that. That was one of the things that I didn't have the knowledge on, and so I didn't have a defense against. So my first NA meeting, I was instantly greeted by these complete strangers who I was quite intimidated by. I'd been very isolated for months, and all of them immediately just complete unconditional acceptance, hugs from these people that I'd never met before. You know, I hadn't had physical contact with a human in probably 6 months at that point, and I was being given hugs. I was being asked what they could do to help. People were giving me their phone numbers and telling me to call them at any time. People were fetching things for me. I got like a round of applause and a newcomer keyring at my first meeting, and was told that I was the most important person in the room, which is a common practice in 12-step programs to say the newcomer's the most important person there, and that's who all the focus should be on. I think a lot of people who say that do it with absolutely genuine good intentions of wanting to help. But the problem is that you feel so supported, so held, so accepted, and then all the conditions start to come in of what you're expected to do. But at the time, it hit something really deep in me and made me want to change. And about 3 days after that, I had another near fatal overdose. And that was my wake-up call that I needed to do something about it. And I came off everything, including my methadone prescription, cold turkey. I went through an absolutely brutal withdrawal over a period of about 6 weeks, which really, really tested my resolve. And through that time, I really threw myself into the 12-step program. I decided that I really wasn't in any position to be critical or to be questioning. And although there were parts of me that did struggle and fight against it, the survival instinct in me told me that I needed to submit. And I did. And that's what took me into my membership of NA. One of the things that I heard a lot in 12-step recovery is that if the program isn't working for you, you're not working the program hard enough. So to give context to how bad things got for me and how much I struggled, I think it's important that I dispel that myth. I worked the program as thoroughly as any person can. I committed to it 100%. I changed everything about myself that the program said that I should change. I worked all 12 steps completely rigorously and honestly. I filled about 8 notebooks on my first round of the steps, and I'd started on a second round before I left because I still felt like I hadn't done enough. I was involved in service at every level that I could. I was sponsoring other people in the program. I took one of my sponsees through all 12 of the steps and kind of relived those steps with her. I was doing service at group level from the time that I was 2 weeks in recovery. I was involved in service at area within my first 3-4 months of recovery. And by the time I'd been in recovery 18 months, I was a regional committee member, which meant that I was involved in the committee that was doing service for the whole of the United Kingdom. I was spending my own money on service. I was giving up my weekends for service. I was going without sleep for service. I was going into service committee meetings where I was having abuse screamed at me. And I was doing it all completely without complaint or question because I was told that it would save my life. If anyone was committed enough to the program to get the benefits of it, it would be me. And I didn't. I stayed what NA would call clean. I had complete total abstinence from all substances for the 3 years that I was in 12-step recovery and for some time after. But I wasn't happy. I was often what I would call surface level happy, where I had this kind of like blissful serenity, total calm, this appearance of being totally on top of things. But what I actually had done was shut down every negative emotional reaction because the program told me that those were my defects of character. And I had to pray hard for them to be removed, work hard to counteract them, and get rid of them by any means necessary. Because if I felt them, if I experienced them, if I thought in those thinking patterns, I would return to the misery that I'd come from of drug use, isolation, and desperation. And I was so scared of that I didn't let myself feel things that I really needed to feel. Things like anger and pain and sadness that were the signals from me that something wasn't right. And those feelings did start to come back towards the end because I could no longer ignore them. And the reason that I could no longer ignore them was I started to uncover what was really going on in Narcotics Anonymous. I started to see what was actually happening to people that I cared about, and it broke me. I'm going to take a little break. The next part's going to be a heavy one. At the beginning of 2020, I began to question my ongoing involvement with Narcotics Anonymous. And this was caused by a series of events that happened in very rapid succession. The first of these being that I became aware of an institutionalized culture of sexual abuse within Narcotics Anonymous that I had been blissfully unaware of up until that point. Because of being non-binary, I hadn't been targeted by anyone because the majority of predatory behaviour happening in the fellowship was by straight men towards women, though not all of it. And because of being non-binary, I also wasn't in with the boys enough to hear about it from them either. So I really hadn't been aware until I found out that my sponsor's sponsor, a guy with over 10 years of recovery time and a job working in a treatment service, was sexually involved with a young woman who was living in a dry house, less than 90 days clean, and very, very emotionally vulnerable, going through some really difficult personal stuff. Around the same time, that same man also lost his job in a treatment service because of sexually inappropriate behaviour with a female client who was in rehab. So that came as a shock just in and of itself, but when I started to speak out about it, initially I reached out to other men in the fellowship to see if they could approach him, to challenge him on his behaviour and get him back on track, because I saw his behaviour as a symptom of his addiction and I was concerned for his well-being as well as the well-being of his victims. And the response I got to it was that I should be minding my own business, focusing on my own defects of character, looking at my part in how I was feeling, and essentially just let him do what he was doing. As I started speaking to more women about this, I started to find out that this was not an isolated incident, not at all. And not long after that, one of the women that I was sponsoring was targeted by a man in the fellowship who manipulated her, financially exploited her, drugged her, and ultimately attempted to rape her. So I had my eyes opened in a big way. As I was still reeling from this, one of my close friends in the fellowship passed away. And this was a man who had given me advice that had saved my life on numerous occasions, and as I did, lived and breathed the programme 100%. I don't know the circumstances surrounding his death, and it's none of my business, but I do know in the months leading up to that, he had had multiple catastrophic relapses, and one of the last conversations we had, he told me that he didn't think he had another one in him, physically. He'd done himself a lot of damage, and I believe that a lot of that damage could have been avoided if he'd had access to other treatment options. Then COVID hit, and the 12-step meetings went entirely online. And it varied area to area and group to group, but in our area, the toxicity that erupted around horrible, nitpicky debates about the correct way to set up online groups, the correct way to register online groups, the correct way to have service positions filled in online groups, minor bureaucratic stuff that people were threatening each other over, abusing each other over, and all of it was ending up directed at me because at the time I was the chair of area. Everything that happened in part 4 that I talked about happened over the space of about 4 months, January to April 2020. But I didn't start to leave NA until June. June was when I went to my last NA meeting, and I didn't fully disengage from 12-step recovery until December. And there were a few reasons for that. Initially, there was some fear. I'd had it absolutely drummed into me from day one that I couldn't survive without this program, that if I tried to make it on my own, it was a guarantee that my progressive disease, as NA sees it, would come back. I would relapse, I would go back to rock bottom, and I would most likely die. That fear did start to diminish, partly because of the doubts I was having, and partly because I honestly thought that was preferable to continuing on in the program. I felt that I couldn't any longer be complicit in what I saw happening, whatever the consequences. I was less willing to risk those consequences for other people, and because I was sponsoring other people in recovery, some of whom were quite vulnerable, and because I was involved in service at a quite serious committed level, I was filling in multiple service positions in our area service committee at the time because of lack of people getting involved in service, and I was worried that me leaving could potentially be the cause of that service committee collapsing and having a negative impact on groups in the area as a whole. Finally, I was working in a 12-step based rehab at the time, and I was concerned about job security, and I was concerned about the impact on my clients who I was working with as well. One of the things that is so tricky about 12-step programs is you become very enmeshed, not just dependent, but other people become dependent on you. And that is the thing that makes it hardest to leave. I knew I would be really letting a lot of people down, good people, well-intentioned people, people who I still want nothing but the best for. And it made it a very, very difficult decision. And the breaking point came for me when I was sitting in a meeting, seeing someone who I knew had done absolutely terrible things, being applauded for hitting a clean time milestone. And I thought, is this what it's about? We count days, we count years, we count decades. And are we getting well? Is this who I'm going to be a decade from now if I stay? Because the people who had the longest clean time often seem to be the sickest and were justifying terrible things as long as they weren't using drugs. And I thought, I'm losing myself. I'm losing myself, and I don't believe in anything I'm doing anymore. So I left NA. I spent the next few months engaging at a distance in another 12-step program called Adult Children of Alcoholics, which has a lot of the problems of 12-step programs, but also taught me a lot about the impact of dysfunctional childhood on the developing mind. And I did take some positive things from that. And that served as essentially my methadone for getting out of the program. It was less toxic, I was less invested, and I was able to use that as a stepping stone to prepare myself to finally leave. Following my exit from 12-step recovery, I had a lot to deal with and a lot of decisions to make. There were some challenges. There were challenges with my work, and they were ones that I was mostly able to navigate. I transferred to a job in a treatment service that wasn't exclusively 12-step based, although some of the work we did promoted the 12 steps. That wasn't the only thing, and I could largely avoid engaging with that. That made it easier, although people did try to make trouble for me, and that isn't a field that I feel really able to work in anymore for various reasons. I did lose a lot of friends. I lost majority of my acquaintances and a lot of my close friends very, very quickly. There are a few people from 12-step recovery who still speak to me, but it can be challenging for me and for them because I have not been quiet about my concerns about the program. And I think a lot of people in 12-step recovery see that as a threat to their own recovery and keep their distance, which I can understand. And I've done the same thing myself when I was a member. But there was a lot of freedom too, but with freedom came a lot of decisions to make and a lot of things to figure out. And I had to really unpick what my recovery meant to me, what my addiction meant to me, because everything I knew about recovery and everything I knew about addiction, I had been taught by NA. I didn't have a single original thought that came from myself about any of that because I hadn't ever allowed myself to, because I was terrified of questioning the program in any way in case that made it less effective. So I had to really start to deprogram from that while also figuring out what skills I'd learned I wanted to retain and wanted to still use. And there were things that I did. You know, the practice of being completely honest is something that I still live by 100%. It was a really good skill to learn, and I learned that through the program, though I don't believe that's the only place I could have learned it. But there were things that were incredibly damaging. I found the first step very damaging for someone as a survivor of trauma to be told over and over again that you are powerless, to have to say that about yourself, to have to use stigmatizing language, like calling my abstinence being clean, like calling myself an addict as if that's all I was. That was doing me harm. That was negative self-talk that was keeping me trapped, and I had to learn to shed it. My step 5, which was the process of sharing my moral inventory with my sponsor in a very kind of puritanical, confessional sense, I had told him about some of my fantasies that I have, some of my sexual thoughts, and had been told that those were a symptom of a spiritual disease. And I had spent the last couple of years attempting to work towards celibacy to try to combat that. And I had to start to unpick that and figure out what I actually thought of myself. I had to learn that my anger was not a defect of character. I had to learn that my anger was the part of me that had been damaged by trauma and wanted to protect me and keep me safe. And instead of shutting that out and treating it like a demon, I had to reintegrate it, learn to live with it, and learn to process it in a healthy way. And doing that has been one of the most freeing things that I have ever done. In February 2021, with 3 years and 3 months of continuous total abstinence from all mind-altering substances, I decided to have a drink. And the world didn't end. I made that decision for a few reasons, but the biggest one for me was that even though I'd been out of 12-step recovery for a while at that point, I was still allowing them to control me. When I'd been a member, I had maintained abstinence because they told me that's what I had to do. And after I left, I maintained abstinence because they told me that it wasn't possible without them. And I realised that if I continued for that reason and that reason alone, I was still going to be being controlled by the program for the rest of my life. I had to think about if I actually believed total abstinence was what I needed to stay well. And I didn't. Alcohol hadn't been a problem substance for me, and substances themselves had never really been the problem. The problem was unmanaged mental health, lack of access to appropriate support, and not knowing how to deal with my problems any other way. I had learned the skills to do that. I had learned that I don't need to fix what's going on in my head with a substance. So as long as I'm not using chemicals for that purpose, to try to control the inside of my brain, to try to take away problems that I don't know how to handle, are the substances the problem? Now, I don't think that means I could go out and socially use heroin, and I have no desire to. But I wanted to reintegrate social moderate drinking into my life, and I have done that successfully. It's been now about 1.5 years since I did that, and alcohol has not become a problem for me. If anything, I now drink quite a bit less than I did in the early days because I found that I actually enjoy alcohol a lot more if it's once or twice a month as a treat. What else has changed since then is that I have moved on with my life. I no longer class myself as in recovery, and I don't count days or months or years. What I count is, do I feel good in myself? Do I feel freedom? Do I feel able to handle problems when they come up? And they do. My mental health is very, very stable these days, but I will never be a person who hasn't experienced trauma. I can't erase the past, and I don't think I would want to, because I have learned a lot of things along the way. I feel like I have a really positive relationship with myself, increased self-esteem and confidence, and I feel able to make decisions without tearing myself apart for them, whether they turn out well or whether they turn out badly. Making mistakes is part of life, and I don't feel the need to obsessively take inventory over it, tear myself apart, or be in a continuous process of making amends. Apologising when I screw up is important, but it doesn't need to be the most important thing in my life. It doesn't need to be... Continuous self-improvement wasn't healthy for me, because I was pushing myself so hard to constantly improve that I could never give myself credit for what I'd already achieved or where I was. I was talking to my mum a little while ago, and she pointed out that when I was in NA, I never once took any credit for my recovery. I would always deflect and thank my higher power or thank the program. And now I can feel proud of myself and proud of how far I've come.